this research article, Enablement and Logistics as Critical Success Factors for Military Operations, comparing Russian and NATO approaches. It was written by Alexander Sollfrank, who was a commander at NATO's JSEC, and Sergei Boeke, who is a political advisor at JSEC. Essentially, it's talking about the logistics that are going into the war in Ukraine right now. Interesting read. I do recommend it to everybody. The link is down below. And we're just going to get into the article and talk about why these authors make the case that what's really going to win wars, and not only in Ukraine, but future wars in general, and God forbid should a war ever break out between NATO and Russia, it'll be logistics. I personally believe that should a war between Russia and NATO ever break out, it'll be the end of the world, because it'll go nuclear. There's really no other way. There's not a scenario I don't envision that happening should again, God forbid, war break out between NATO and Russia. Nonetheless, it is informative to read this, because I think for the foreseeable future, and I mean probably the remainder, okay, I shouldn't say that, miracles always happen. So for the next couple of decades, for sure, the relationship between NATO and Russia are going to be poisonous, as John Mearsheimer likes to note. So, in the best of cases, right? Nonetheless, it is informative to see how both of these countries and military bloc are approaching conflict, right? So the article starts by noting that during the initial assault in 2022 by Russia or the initial incursion by Russia into Ukraine, the logistical problems and vulnerabilities are what really stalled their progress, and the Ukrainian military was able to capitalize on that and push back the Russians, as we recall that happened. At the time, General Valery Shaluzny mentioned that the conflict had gone from a maneuver phase to a positional one, and we saw that the battle lines had hardened, and that's more or less where we are. Even today, midway through 2025, obviously this has changed in recent months. We'll get into that in another video, but for the time being, and mind you that this was published in 2024, which means that it was being written up in 2023. So this is the information that the authors had at the time. And yeah, so in the orange on the right hand side, we could see that what they intended to do in this article, which is they're trying to compare Russia and NATO's approaches to enablement, which essentially is just is logistics, right? All the logistics that goes into war. As we're going to see, logistics isn't just the movement of things, but also the movement of information and the standardization of definitions, as we're going to get into as well. Right, so they really emphasize that logistics are what underpin military operations. And then I guess one looks at big battles in history, not just in the 20th century, but also throughout basically human conflict. And it's always logistics, right? How can you get resupplied? Can you get fresh men onto the battlefield? Yeah, just logistics are what wins wars. Oh, this is a picture of the Kerch Bridge that connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. And we know that Ukraine has been very effective in hitting this bridge on occasion. They haven't quite been able to destroy it outright, but again, the jury is still out on that, and yeah, we'll see what happens. Yeah, again, the first part of the article is just talking about how logistics are important. Military logistics have been, this is the first, not criticism, but observation that the authors make about NATO's logistics network. And they notice that military logistics in NATO have been commercialized and civilized with the adoption of business practices such as supply chain management and integrating the just-in-time concept in outsourcing. So just-in-time concept is that perhaps what the battlefield or troops on the front require doesn't actually exist, but they order it and then it's made and then it's sent to the battlefield. That's not good. And we're going to see that Russia has a very different approach to this. And recently, this is mid-2025 now, they've opened up a new factory where they're producing en masse kamikaze drones. And that is turning out to be very problematic for the Ukrainians to deal with. The question is whether the just-in-time model that NATO has adopted can also integrate just-in-case thinking to survive strategic shocks and sustain large-scale interstate conflict. And the authors make the case that that perhaps is not the best approach at the strategic level. It links a state's industrial base to the military enterprise, operational, tactical, logistics, concerned supply chains, flow management. NATO considers logistics as the science of planning and carrying out movement and maintenance of forces, which, there's really no argument there. But what that entails actually varies by country, and that was surprising to find out because NATO has existed for many, many decades. I would have thought that there would be more standardization by this point and true interoperability. But again, the article goes on to talk about how even in 155 millimeter shells, there is an interoperability between the howitzer systems that fire them, which is again very, very confusing because I thought that was the whole point of NATO, right? In any case, they note that their article predominantly focuses on the strategic operational level, how enablement and logistics are a prerequisite for military operations, and where the Russian model differs from NATO's approach. I'm not going to read through it. I recommend you guys read through the article. It's incredibly informative, even if you don't have a deep understanding of military operations. This is I clearly don't, but it's still informative because it allows you to understand why governments enable or pass certain laws and reallocate certain budgets, and you understand more or less where the changes need to occur. And unfortunately, we live in a time of increasing geopolitical competition where we have to work together, right? The collective West, I think, needs to really put its differences aside and reconsider the collective defense. Because one of the things the article notes in the last pages of the article is that countries have not only different definitions but different perceived threats. So meaning that countries that are obviously closer to Russia have a more acute perception of risk from Russia than, say, for example, countries in the western part of Europe, which is to be understood, right? It's basic. It's a very detailed article, and again, I recommend all of you read it. I do want to cite one example, and this was again citing the lack of interoperability, not only in equipment and personnel, but also in the road system that would enable countries to quickly mobilize troops for a quick response group, or I guess what the military calls a QRF, quick reaction force. And I want to say, quote, one of the biggest impediments to military mobility on the NATO side is the bureaucracy of the cross-border movement permissions, which was fascinating to find out. So if you read the article, you'll find out that apparently to be able to make military movements across borders in a time of crisis, you have to fill out paperwork, which makes no sense, but this is where we are. I continue. A frequently cited example concerns French Leclerc tanks on their way to enhance forward presence mission in Romania in 2022 that were held up at the German border. The axle weight of the French heavy equipment transport trucks that carry the tanks exceeded the maximum allowed on German roads, and the tanks had to be transferred to rail transport. There are many complex rules and regulations that need to be met for a military convoy to cross a frontier. They concern, among others, customs and tax rules, which, again, confusing. The transport of oversized goods, dangerous goods, and munitions. The latter is a particular cause for concern. Few ports are cleared for receiving large quantities of munitions, and transporting munitions across Europe is particularly complex and bureaucratic. End quote. For those of you, or those of us, have lived in Europe, we know just how complicated it is to do basically anything. And I mean quite literally from moving into a new place to even if you have the proper paperwork to opening a bank account. It is the most frustrating thing you can ever do. And so Europe, even at the moment of defending itself, bureaucracy cannot be overlooked. And that is a big, big problem because Russia does not have that problem, as the article notes. Obviously, Russia has a completely different political and economic system. Therefore, they are subject to different rules and can make things happen a lot quicker, as we found out. A couple more things I wanted to highlight. Ports, railways, power stations, and the electricity network, the internet, and fuel pipelines all play a vital role in enablement, or the logistics, as I was mentioning earlier. And Russia has an elaborate system that provides theater enablers as well as combat enablers as primary theater enabler. Russia has dedicated a railway brigade to maintain and repair its strategic railway network. So apparently they have about some 66,000 working rail cars in 2021. Who knows what that is in 2022? That means that those 66,000 working rail cars can be used to move anything that the front line needs, which is, yeah, to be honest, that surprised me because one of the more interesting things that economists always mention about Russia is that its economy, I think, is about the size of Italy's, if not smaller, and it's impressive what they can do with such a small economy. To be quite honest, it really is. The general logistical infrastructure of the Russian army is complex, with 11 material technical support brigades, each fielding 2 truck battalions of about 400 transport vehicles. Again, very impressive. Interesting that note, because again, I'm not a military guy, is that in the US, for example, the US military, there's an estimated 10 support soldiers to every combat fighter, which I thought was fascinating. So most of the people in the military are actually somehow, in one way or another, involved in logistics, right? So it behooves the Europeans to really get their act together and work together to be able to get logistics off the ground. A couple more things I want to emphasize before closing this out is that NATO faces a different set of challenges. The current ecosystem is built on the principles of outsourcing where possible, just-in-time supply chains and limited stockpile. So they mentioned that, the authors mentioned that a couple of times throughout the article. So it's where I also agree that I think Europeans really need to pay close attention to be able to smooth out those edges between the countries. And so the railway, flatbeds, military transport, fuel trucks, and other supporting units are simply not there for NATO, which is worrisome. So it's not only the logistics, but also building the actual functional units within that system that are going to be needed at a time when budgetary crises are biting everywhere in Europe. I just I don't understand how that could take place, right? Nonetheless, we have to make it happen. Yeah, so again, it mentions the economics. It mentions the fact that legal frameworks need to be updated, covering aspects such as requisitioning in military service, rights and duties of civilians in wartime situation, their potential status as combatants in international law, provisions for general safety and security. There are many, is the 5.5 millimeter shells I was talking about, standardization as I talked about, talk about how at this point, I want to make that very clear because things move very quickly in war, right? And we found out from the time this article was published to what is actually happening on the battlefield, unfortunately now in mid-2025, things change. So just because a problem has been diagnosed doesn't mean that a solution cannot be found. And depending on how grave the situation, a solution can be found quickly. So they talk about deterrence and much in the field of enablement logistics falls under national responsibility, but collective defense needs a form of collective enablement. So basically, they point out a problem, they point out, the authors, where the solutions lie, and a lot of it is in collective, in working together. So as a military bloc, I think NATO has clearly the know-how, the political will. It remains to be seen. I hope they can get their act together because changing geopolitical realities, you just don't know really where the threats are going to arise and where you're going to find issues, right? I say this because this is mid-2025, so when the authors wrote this article, there was a different US administration, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but we will talk about it at some point. The current US administration has made in no uncertain terms their intentions on Greenland, for example. And so, Europe needs to pay attention to what it's doing, and it needs to be able to defend itself, I think. So with that, we'll leave it here, and let's keep the conversation going. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below.